Cloud service, okay. Cloud server, yeah.
Okay. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to this session, our last session in this series of talks on Indigenous nations. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce and welcome Dr. Lee Francis to our series. And Dr. Lee Francis is the Executive Director of Native Realities, an Indigenous imagination company dedicated to unleashing the Indigenous imagination through popular culture, including comic books, graphic novels, games, toys, and collectibles, and many more things. Through Native Realities, Dr. Francis also founded the Indigenous ComicCon in 2016 and opened Red Planet Books and Comics, the only native comic shop in the world, in 2017, which now serves as the headquarters and distribution center for native and indigenous books and other media. He is also the founder of IndigiPopX, formerly the Indigenous ComicCon, the world's only indigenous popular culture convention. Dr. Francis is also an award-winning performance poet and slam champion. He was a part of the 26th Albuquerque City Slam team and the 28th College National Champion Slam team, and served as the coach for the 2008 Albuquerque City Slam team. He has been performing for more than 30 years and has been active in the Albuquerque theater scene for more than a decade, after spending a year touring the United States as part of the Repertory Theater of America. He is also a highly regarded storyteller and has performed stories at numerous venues around the US and throughout the world. In 2014, he received his PhD in education from Texas State University with a focus on Indigenous education systems and Indigenous leadership. He has been published in several peer-reviewed academic journals over the past decade, and his work on Indigenous popular culture and on natives and pop culture is highly regarded by universities throughout the United States, and not only the United States. As an evaluator, Dr. Francis specializes in Indigenous evaluation methods and has been contracted by numerous local and national Native or Indigenous organizations to conduct systems and program evaluation. And today he will be talking to us about Indigenous ComicCon. Really, that's all I have to say. Welcome, Lee. It's a pleasure to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Svetlana. It's so great to see you again, digitally as well. Goatsi hapa tawatawashrap wahiname Lee Francis, washeshka wakame, eve medicaname. Good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I'm afternoon on the East Coast in the United States. So good afternoon and good evening to all of you. I greeted you in my traditional language, which is Keres, from the Pueblo of Laguna, what we call Kawake, which is 45 miles west of Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the southwestern area of the United States. My family, that's on my dad's side, my family is from the village of Powati that we call Quischi. And on my mom's side, just all Americana. So from middle of the West, the state of Missouri, which is just dead center in the United States. I'm thrilled to be able to be here. This is, I think this is the third time I've gotten to speak by Zoom wise, and I've gotten to been there one time in person out to the university, which was such a great experience in 2019. So it's been a couple of years since we were out there. Someday we'll get the chance to come visit again, because it's always lovely to see everybody in person. But for right now, this is wonderful, and I very much appreciate having the opportunity to talk about Comic-Cons and the Indigenous Comic-Con and kind of what that means and why we chose to found and create this Indigenous Comic-Con, now IndigiPopX. Because we want to talk about pop culture and Native American peoples and Indigenous peoples in popular culture. But let me kind of start at the beginning of the narrative and a little bit about me, because it all kinds of it interweaves the biography, thank you. That's all the things I've done throughout my life. I just like to do a lot of stuff. But I've always been a fan of comic books and graphic novels and popular culture, even from when I was young. My father was a huge science fiction fan, fantasy fan, and technologist. So we were early adopters of technology. Personal computing came into our household in the early 80s. There was a computer called a TRS-80 that you could have, which, had a color screen, and it was just this throwback, right? It was this big old boxy machine, and you do word processing on it essentially, and you could play like really, really basic games. And my aunt owned one of the early Apples, right? So one of the early, I think the Apple I or the Apple II. So I came by it very honestly in terms of, being part of really pop culture and living in this, this pop culture realm. And as a Native kid, I had a Native American young person. I also had all of my cultural background that went with that, and they kind of intertwined. Now, I grew up in the suburbs. I grew up outside of cities, so I didn't grow up on the reservation. My grandmother lived out there. My great grandmother lived out there in New Mexico, and we would go visit every summer. And I spent considerable amount of time with both of them and learning from both of them. But for all intents and purposes, I was an urban suburban kid in the 80s and 90s. And I think as part of that, and as part of formulating my identity was, there was sort of like an underpinning of the Native American culture and heritage, but my expression and really where I aligned my cultural values was being a nerd. Movies and pop culture and comic books and animated series and video games. That was my thing. That was where I was able to find my own identity and relevance. As I continued to grow up and continue to learn more, and finding more connections to my own personal history, my community's history in Laguna, but also the history of Native American peoples, developed later in high school and moved on into college when I began doing work around theater and performance and the representations of Native American peoples in American and European theater, stretching back as far as the 1660s, all the way until like the 1900s, 1950s, modern day, and how Native people were represented in what we would essentially say, to begin with, the initial concepts of popular culture, right? Plays, now we think of them very much as something for, like a much more high culture and, intellectual. But during this time period, there was a lot of touring plays, and the centers of publishing, the centers of printing, the centers of manufacturing were where these plays would be presented. And so the populace would come to see this work, and gain an understanding, especially around how Native people are being represented, and often not in their own voices and not of their own approaches. And I think that continues to be important. And one of the reasons why Indigipop X, which the full title is the Indigenous Pop Culture Expo, is why I wanted to found something like that, why I wanted to establish something like that, was mostly because for 300 years here in the United States, we didn't really have control over our own media and how we were presented in media, in pop culture, in any of the communication and communicative arts, save for, arts and crafts, tourist destinations where we would be able to showcase our arts and culture. But often it was, it was looked at from an academic standpoint. So people would write about the cultures and take pictures of the cultures and do art of the cultures as something separate from our own identities and our own histories as Native American peoples. So coming out of theater, I did a lot of research and a lot of work around that. I began my professional career in education in 1999, 2000, shortly after I graduated from university for my undergraduate, and began teaching writing workshops and teaching Native American young people out on the reservation And what I began to see was a sense that there was something that was missing in terms of the media. And what I began to notice was what was missing was representation, Native American peoples in the stuff that I really like to read, which is comic books and science fiction, graphic novels, and fantasy, and all of those particular spaces that I grew up with. And I also noticed that Native American literature was very, very narrow. You had a lot of histories. You had a couple of writers, and then you had some writers down writing for young people. But there was this big expanse of like nothing, right? And let's say this is still in recent history, right? So this is not something that happened in the 80s or 90s. This is the 2000s when I began teaching, and the number of titles and books that are available on the shelves and the number of titles that teachers are teaching from is very sparse. And so I start kind of looking at this, and I'm doing education, doing college prep, and I'm working through all of this stuff. And I go and get my PhD. And while I'm working on my PhD, I begin having conversations with other really great Native comic book artists and creatives about starting a publishing company and the need to have a means of creation and a means of production and distribution. And so out of that comes Native Realities in its first iteration, which was a publishing company doing really K through kindergarten through, college, books, YA, comic books, textbooks. We had a whole big mission to just do a whole bunch of books that were really about telling stories of Native people from our own perspectives, sort of writing the pop culture history, because a lot of that pop culture history, again, wasn't dictated by Native peoples. And that's a good moment, I think, right now to kind of pause and talk a little bit about the way that history developed, and specifically having, this focus on Western identity and Western Native communities and tribes. In the United States, there are over 570 federally recognized tribes. So there's a recognition process that goes through the federal government here in the United States. There's another 100 or so that are state recognized. And these are tribal communities, and they were maybe bands from one of what we would consider a bigger tribal group, or they were their own independents in many locations in many ways. And because of the expanse of the United States and what happened after colonial incursions into the United States of a lot of tribes that suffered disease and warfare and merged with other communities and whatnot, you're still left with a number of groups that stretch from coast to coast and top to bottom. And over time, because of the policies of genocide, extermination, assimilation, and removal, the East Coast Native communities essentially ceased to exist. There are no reservations out here. Tribal communities they have headquarters, they have addresses, but they don't have federal reserve land, United States reserve land, or treaty land, even though many of these things were guaranteed through the treaty rights and negotiations with the United States federal government. And so what you get is, as we expand and as America comes into its fullness around manifest destiny and this pushing towards westward expansion, the mythology of America really takes hold, because America really is able to produce a lot more. And this concept of the West emerges, because there's nothing like that in any other location, really, right? You have East Coast, which is very forested and dense, and then you have the Midwest, and again, these are very big generalizations. The Midwest, which is very flat and agricultural, and then you have this big swath of this mountain land, which is arid and rocky, and then there's these grand sweeping vistas in these plains, and it captured a lot of both the American and the European imaginations. And so you have a lot of European folks from Germany, from France, from England, from Spain that come to America during this time period to see the great American West. And they write about that. And the Americans themselves are writing about that, because there's this idea of these exploits of being able to push in this westward expansion to essentially settle and colonize these traditional homelands in these spaces, right? And so part of that, because it's right around when this media begins to absolutely, like American media really begins to dominate during that time frame. I mean, you see this in the early 1900s. This is, you know, film and television. This is jazz. This is the West. So everything from about 1890 on, it begins to solidify this mythos of the Native American, and what they look like and how they behave and how they, you know, how they dress, what kind of culture they are. And it stretches from the plains. You basically go into two camps and categories. You have the plains folks, which are the fierce horseback warriors, and you have the agricultural folks, the Southwest folks, which are my people, the Pueblo people, and Navajo folks. And you kind of get the sprinkling of Cherokee in there as well, because they're kind of around that band, but they're not. And Cherokee includes all of the tribes in Oklahoma, not, you know, the separate tribes that all got forced into Oklahoma. There was more than 60 tribal nations that got squished into Oklahoma during forced removal. So you see these two concepts emerge, the fierce warrior and the agriculturalists. And that is what becomes dominant and present in pop culture. That leaves out the East Coast, that leaves out the California coast, that leaves out a lot of the Pacific Northwest, because a lot of their stuff is just kind of like migrated over. So you think of totem poles, well, those show up within outside of teepees, you know, and horses and headdresses. And so this amalgamation of Native content, Native culture and identity begins fostering in the early 1900s. So as I'm teaching, as I'm working with Native comic book artists, we're trying to figure out this idea of how do we publish in a way that we can reorient the public using a graphic medium like comic books to showcase and to highlight and to you know, provide a counter narrative toward this what has been essentially in mass media for 300 years, a very tall order. But we had some really cool folks that were part of that, and so the first Native Realities was born out of that. And as we essentialized it, it became, let's just focus on comic books and graphic novels, games, toys, and collectibles, everything sort of in the nerdosphere, or, you know, as we say, indigenerds, right? So indigenerdity, indigenerdity, like that was really what we wanted to focus on, what I wanted to focus on with the company. Flash forward about 2 years, I did a lot of work in education, school systems, and found an opportunity to do this work full time with the resources that we could utilize and create and build out this company. And so that's, you know, 2014, you know, launch Native Realities. About 2016, I'm done with doing sort of the direct education work, and I take a trip to Australia. And in Australia, I see very similar things, right? In Australia, go to the comic shops. Our relatives over there have a lot of, our indigenous relatives over there have a lot of connections, a lot of shared history, a lot of commonalities, and also very limited and little media, right? And representational media by, for, and about Native and indigenous peoples. So I get this idea. We've been talking about it for a while. It was like, we should host a Comic-Con. And a couple of comic book creators were talking about the same thing. We're like, we should do this. Let's host it at this library. Let's host it over here. And I was like, well, I've got a hole in my schedule in the fall of 2016. I got a hole in my schedule in November 2016. I was like, I'm just going to book it, because if I don't book this kind of stuff, I just talk about it for a while. So I was like, I'm putting it on the calendar. I'm going to find a location. I'm going to announce it. So I'm in Australia. I'm having these conversations, and I sit down and start doodling our first logo and what our first logo is going to look like. And I have this idea, and I start putting the concept of this Comic-Con together in my head. And so it was really born in my time that was there. I think I built the first website while I was there, and then you know, come out of that and come home. I invite our first guest, Jeffrey Vergay, who's a great comic book artist, and then I get a whole bunch of other guests, film and television folks, science fiction, fantasy, comic books, graphic novels, and tabletop, analog and digital games. So we get everybody as part of that. And so what comes out of that is this, which is our first year, and I'm going to show you this right now, of the Comic-Con. Where is it? There it is. And I need to share my sound. And it's this one. And there we go.
I think you need to start it. We only see the page.
It's not coming up.
Oh, well, we see the YouTube page, but it seems to be on stop. Okay, now something
Okay,
else.
that's fine. I think it, hold on, let me try again.
There may be a lag.
It could be. Let's scroll it back. Is the sound
Now
up?
it's working. Yeah.
Okay. Is that working still?
Nope.
Nope. Okay. I know what's happening. All right. Hold on one second. Sorry, everybody. Give me one moment. Let me go ahead and just do it like this. It's when I pull it. It's when I pull it out. So you just get to watch it over here. You can see all of my. You can see how the algorithm works on my side here. There we go. Good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Three, two, one.
People talk about gathering of nations. This is the gathering of nerds. And I believe that that's going to draw people to Albuquerque to share in this indigenous comic art that we love.
Nothing else like this has been done before in terms of bringing all of these worlds of pop culture together for Native people. There's so much perceptions of Native art needing to be pottery or jewelry, and those are incredibly viable and valuable. And this is as well. So when we're looking at the kind of support that entrepreneurs need, right here, right now, we get to show everybody what we're doing, and I think that validates our own work.
You know, I've spent my life trying to educate non-Indians about Native Americans, and I think this new style of educating particularly younger people will expedite all of that educational experience that we need.
I've seen a lack of outlet for tribal entrepreneurs to actually distribute and get their business out. This is finally a venue with their brand, their name on it, so that they can get out and feel comfortable in the space promoting themselves.
I'm very used to the Native American art market. That's how I make my living. And this is a whole nother world. And this actually has this potential to introduce people to the native cultures and native arts without even knowing that's really what's happening.
All of these kids I see walking around are getting inspired by people that look like them.
And just to see the kids excited about it, you know, the youth, that's what it's all about.
I think in Albuquerque, we can stand out from the crowd. There's a lot of little seeds being planted here that I think people will take back to the Pueblo, they'll take back to their community.
Albuquerque is the centerpiece. The indigenous community here is very strong. I want folks to purchase this stuff, and we want folks to hang it on their wall, and we want folks to read these stories. That's the support. We got people from Baltimore, from New York, from San Diego. I heard people came in from Australia. That shows us that it is valuable. When you see all of these people around you, it's incredible.
So that was year one. If I can get out of here, there it is. Hold on one second. It's all the way at the top. I gotta move my camera. There we go. Excellent. So that was our first year, and we hosted that at the National Hispanic Cultural Center in Albuquerque. It was a 3-day exercise in pure chaos for me. We had 20 guests, 50, 60 vendors on place. We had programming for 3 days. It was a wild and crazy event, and it just was amazing because the kinds of folks that were turning up, what we launched in that space 8 years ago, coming into 9 years now, was something that had never been seen before. So we continued on for the next 2 years, and I'll show you one of the things that came in from one of the following years. Let me find that one. And this was one of the following years that they did an interview on us with on Al Jazeera English, AJ English.
Heroes, Star Wars characters, costumed role players, all Native American at the second annual Indigenous ComicCon in New Mexico. The artists here draw inspiration from rap, anime, skater culture, and more, proudly calling themselves Indiginerds.
I think a lot of nerd culture helps us to deal with like the real issues that we face, and it gives us a positive, like a lot of it is really positive and hopeful.
There are many issues troubling Native Americans: poverty, disease, violence, drug and alcohol abuse, and the generational trauma from centuries of conquest and colonization. This event gives Native American artists a chance to express themselves in ways that challenge stereotypes and caricatures. Artist Ricardo Cate draws on the long tradition of Native humor.
We're not stoic like Hollywood always depicts us. We're very funny people, and I just want to showcase how funny we are. We see humor in just about everything.
As Native American people, why have we been reduced?
Brothers Ken and John Little made a documentary about what they regard as offensive sporting names like the Washington Redskins.
We want to reclaim our identities. We kind of want to take back, a lot of the stereotypes and kind of flip them and just, kind of represent ourselves more accurately.
Comedian and artist Bobby Wilson points to storytelling traditions perfected over hundreds of generations.
What are we going to do for 9 months out of a wintertime in Minnesota in the 1700s but tell each other stories? You know what I mean? With any culture, art is how we deal with not only our own issues, but it's how we interpret our place in this world and why is it that we exist.
Lee Francis is the convention organizer.
The ability to adapt and draw in these other cultural elements is that act of resistance. It's that act of defiance. Something like this provides hope. It sparks the imagination. What more than superheroes and space travel spark the imagination? And it also ties us back to our traditional stories, because in those we had superheroes, we had space travelers, and so that it's that full circle.
Adaptation and art flourishing from one Native generation to the next. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Isleta Pueblo, New Mexico.
All right, so that was year 2, and we hosted a 3rd year at Isleta Pueblo, and we were getting started to host a 4th year in Albuquerque, in downtown Albuquerque, when the pandemic hit, which forced us to shut down. But the previous year, we had 2 amazing events, one in Denver, Colorado, and one that we finally were able to get and host a Comic-Con in Melbourne, Australia, and the first Indigicon over there. So in all of these efforts, the concept for all of this was much like what we wanted to do in publishing, but also to do it in person, is to create a showcase for Native and Indigenous artists and writers, storytellers, creatives, entrepreneurs, to be able to have an opportunity to showcase their work, to showcase their creativity, to showcase their art, and to build on their cultural elements in a way that's not stereotypical, in a way that we hadn't seen in popular media. And very deliberate in wanting to create and bring together these sort of 4 elements, these 4 aspects of video games, science fiction and fantasy, comic books, graphic novels, and film and television. For me personally, in terms of founding this, the idea was that I wanted to hang out with all these folks and couldn't go to all the conferences where they were all hanging out at. You had the Comic-Cons, and there'd be some Native folks there, but we'd be a small, like there'd be 2 or 3 at most, at best. Same thing in the science fiction fantasy worlds. You had some folks that would show up at the gaming conferences. They have an Indigenous Gamers Conference that I was like, oh, I want to go to that so bad, and I couldn't get them. So I was like, well, I couldn't get there. So I was like, well, let's bring them out here. And then film and television gives us a chance to kind of provide those hooks for community that because that's really the biggest mass media. It's like old theater, right? So here's all these film and television stars that we see on a regular basis, and there's something we do psychologically for these folks that they're just like, oh my gosh, they're on TV. They're very important, right? But they have the chance to showcase Native identity in a way that we haven't seen or understand. And so that was really the whole point behind a lot of the work in the first couple of years. And now in this year, we are finally coming back in March 2023 here in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, for IPX and Digipop X. Our wonderful event is back. We've got some special guests that are already lined up. We'll have our vendors coming out pretty soon. We'll have programming, but we're pretty excited to be able to run this back again, because we haven't been able to do this for 4 years. Mostly we didn't feel comfortable, and I made an executive decision to not host this coming back too quick. We weren't going to be going up in 2020, but other events started coming back up in 2021 and 22. And we just really didn't feel comfortable about the amount of time it takes to plan and put everything together, but also just not wanting to host something before the gun. We weren't sure where everything was going with the pandemic. We weren't sure what was going to be taking place. So we wanted to be really clear and careful about when we reemerged. And we had a great opportunity from the First Americans Museum, which is an incredible Native American museum in Oklahoma City. And they were just so welcoming and inviting. So we said, well, we should do it here. We should have the chance to go and visit some of our other relatives. And again, kind of take this around for other communities to be able to experience and explore and have a good time with this. So I think that's a good, I'll say that's a good kind of stopping moment right now. And I can just kind of open it up if there's a conversation. I know, Svetlana, you had your own experience as well with this, because you came out to visit us a couple of times, and we even put you on volunteer duty at one point. So, because you were just chilling. But if anybody wants to kind of chat for a little bit, we got, I don't know, like 10, 12 minutes or so. And we can kind of talk, and if there's questions that you have. But I think this really gives a good understanding of the why, the how, and the ongoing need of something like this, where we can bring Native communities together to show different, ways of Native identity that mainstream media doesn't often portray for Native peoples. So, that's that.
Well, many thanks, Leah, already for the talk. People, the floor is open. Any questions, comments, impressions, anything you'd like to ask? Here's the opportunity.
You can also drop it in the chat too.
Yeah, that works as well.
You can type away. What was your,